Hey everyone, how's it going out there? How's your weekend going? Welcome to Trauma-Based Mind Control, the hijacking of human will. And welcome back to my channel. So glad to see all of you again. This is going to actually be a series, I think, because when I started diving into this subject, it kind of went in a few different directions. And one of those directions is the direction of the kind of the biointelligence of this energy center in the body. And I found it was like too much information to traverse in one video. I'm trying to make these videos a little bit shorter, so it's not as much information and kind of dense information packed into like a 40-minute video or whatever. And I want to do some how-to videos because there's different kind of practices and techniques and protocols that kind of go in with releasing the consciousness from mind control in the center, and they traverse both physical practices and also kind of meditation, yoga, energetic practices. And of course, there's always an overlap there. And that's my favorite thing, is finding that overlap between the biointelligence in the body and then into kind of the nervous system and the energy systems from there. And I think essentially that's what yoga really is finding that union between all the different parts of ourselves and finding a harmony there. So of course, it's going to be through the lens of yoga, like most of my ideas and writings and works are, although it's usually a pretty unique way of interpreting yoga after about 25 years of practicing yoga and through so many different incarnations of myself. Anyway, so this is about the fourth time I've tried to, this is the fourth time I've recorded this video. I did it 3 times yesterday and I lost every single one, which I'm pretty bummed about. I had a pretty bad attitude at the end of the day yesterday, but I decided to just wake up fresh today and do it again, do it on my computer instead of my phone. Having a lot of technical difficulties with how I want to set up my video space so that it really works gracefully for me. So anyway, this is my 4th take. Hopefully this one works and goes through. So let's just dive right in. So the will center is located right below the diaphragm, right, specifically, and it's the solar plexus center in yoga. And there's a sort of siphoning off of energy that happens at this center collectively. And this shows up energetically, it shows up physically, it shows up psychologically, and it shows up ideologically. So what I want to do is kind of traverse the different aspects of that territory. So as I said, it shows up in the biointelligence of the muscles as well as the organs. And it also shows up in one's emotional intelligence and through the conscience often, which we'll talk about. Now, energetically, it looks like cords or filaments or even a vacuum at the center that is always seeking to be filled. So when it's not operating well, it'll always seek to fill itself from the external world somewhere. It seeks to subvert itself to a perceived outside power source of some sort, whether that power source be an addiction of some sort or authority, or even the desire to fit in with the group. The theme is always the same, and that theme is this desire to fill oneself, one's sort of perceived emptiness, with an external power source, often in the form of approval, right? So the masses can actually be corded into the matrix, to the control grids, the greater control grids, through this center. And as far as control grids or grids go, there are many different kinds of grids, right? There are many different kinds of fields. And when we talk about the control grids, we're talking about the grids of basically collective consensus reality that are overlaid onto the organic creation field grids. And these are composed of manufactured narratives and social engineering, all the beliefs, traumas, dramas, culturally and individually kind of fit into this control grid. And so what it is all these different beliefs and narratives and everything have an energetic component that creates an energetic grid. And we actually plug into these different grids through different energy centers, and through the consciousness and the frequency of that energy center. So it becomes imperative to regain consciousness at this center and plug into the organic creation field grid of the planet, rather than plugging into this control grid. And then to move the will forward consciously from there. So the solar plexus center carries all of our beliefs around the will to be, to act, our self-worth, our self-esteem, our selfhood in general, our value structures. It is where the conscience can be subverted through matrix mind control, institutionalization of consciousness. So power struggles of all kinds exist here, as well as a sense of personal power or powerlessness. And what are some of the symptoms of when this center isn't quite operating properly energetically? Those would be tightness of breath at the diaphragm, trouble getting a deep breath, really like shrugging and raising the shoulders as you breathe, rather than having this deeper belly breath more often. Digestive problems or sluggish gut, depression or lack of energy and passion, addictions of all kinds, excessive shame or guilt, and cowardliness in the face of social pressure, cowardliness around being an individual, and loss of self to groupthink, lack of confidence, lack of self-esteem, unstable self-image, lack of focus towards one's goals, and parroting of empty cliche slogans, absence of original thought. So these are some of the symptoms. Another symptom or manifestation of subversion at the will center is the villain/savior complex. So the villain-savior complex is often courted through this will center. So when someone subverts their will through trusting the science, through attacking the free exchange of ideas over fear of disinformation, this is a symptom of the subversion of individual will. Evil, Scary Poppins. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but she's a perfect example of the expression of this power dynamic. The Ministry of Truth, right? The Ministry of Truth and the masses' willingness to go along with the subversion of their own inner authority. Okay, the masses' willingness to go along with the subversion of their own inner authority, of the right to decide for themselves what is true or not, based on a wide array of information from all sides of the aisle. So this is a classic expression as well, the subversion of consciousness at this will center. It is also the center where divine will meets individual will. It is where we either move from unconscious subjective traumas, perpetuating our karma forward through the will, through plugging into the collective consensus control grid, or where we move from conscious, alive, creative flow, from being plugged into the organic creation field of the planet. So the I am consciousness that I often speak of gets subverted on a personal level, on an individual personal level through this center. Now, generally the subconscious or unconscious mind is the driver of will in the human being. Feelings and traumas stored in this layer of being drive thoughts and beliefs, and the combination of these two phenomena drive the will forward. These feeling states are a product of past karma stored in the unconscious. So these subjective feeling states are a product of past karma stored in the unconscious. The subjective feeling states create a sort of momentum that propels us forward. When joined with our more conscious thought or image forms, or even, as I said, these manufactured narratives, the will to act then arises and drives us forward into the perpetuation of future karma. So it's a combination of this unconscious kind of subjective feeling karma that creates this momentum and propels us forward. We combine it with these more conscious thoughts and image forms that arise in our inner screen. And then boom, that propels us forward. It's not really rocket science. You know, what the will is just our inclination to act and where that inclination comes from, right? So I talk a lot about brain hemisphere synchronization on here. And again, we can see the importance of this practice when it comes to being subverted in these ways. Those that are completely right-brained or completely left-brained or too dominant will not be able to navigate to the truth clearly, especially in cases where subjective validity of truth is way out of balance with objective or observational logic. The individual will be easily mind controlled. Subversion to dogma or fundamental religious belief that is not rooted in gnosis, right? Empty abstract thought versus alive, present, direct experience are also products of subversion accomplished through the extreme imbalance of left-right brain dominance. So it becomes really important to learn how to hang in the space between subjective and objective experience. And that's, again, that's left and right brain balance, which is also masculine feminine balance, right? So our ability to experience directly or intuit or instinctually know something, you know, this is the more feminine. Our ability to analyze objectively or observe, right? This is the more masculine. The logic and the feeling, subjective feeling or intuition. And finding the balance between these two sides of ourselves is what makes us immune to mind control. It's one of the things that makes us immune. So trauma-based mind control works mostly by keeping the masses in a state of trauma response or as a form of mind control. The constant onslaught of emotionally charged ideological narratives fed through the outer screen, right, keep the individual in a hyper-aroused reactionary state and therefore perpetuating the manufactured narratives. So this keeps humanity in a certain bandwidth of experience, right? It keeps us in a feeling state, right? It locks our subjective feeling state into this lower unconscious expression. And this is what engineers and drives collective will forward. Because again, if you have this unconscious subjective feeling state creating this momentum, and then you've got your conscious thought and image forms are actually coming from this external screen of manufactured narratives and stories, then that actually drives collective will. Also not rocket science. So it becomes increasingly important to know how to induce your own parasympathetic nervous system state through yoga and meditation, etc., in order to remain immune to the hypnotic mind control mechanisms that they implement. So it's actually a kind of like shock therapy almost, what media and social media and the narratives and everything does. It's if they can shock us over and over and over and over again, energetically, spiritually, within the nervous system, emotionally, it locks sort of our nervous system state into a bandwidth, right? That's going to align us with certain realities, like I said, like the control grid. So it keeps us locked into this control grid rather than accessing the true organic creation field that's then going to propel our will consciously, align it with this divine will, align with the I am consciousness, and actually create original creative momentum, right? So they use that kind of like shock therapy to do that. And it's a form of social engineering and conditioning. So one of the ways they do this is by manufacturing consent, right? And one way that they manufacture consent, one of their favorite ways, is through guilt and fear. So a lot of us might already be walking around with a somewhat subverted will center through our childhood trauma, okay? And this trauma through the will center often is possessed by a sense of debilitating shame. So the will becomes paralyzed because the stability of the person, the stability of the I am, and the consciousness of will and the confidence is actually locked into a shame response. Shame and fear are usually kind of woven together. And they actually use this guilt and shame as a form of trauma-based mind control. So they layer it on there. You know, it's like a lot of people already have that to some degree from childhood, some worse than others. And they just like layer that on there. And so this is where the conscience is often wired through this childhood trauma and then further subverted through institutional authority and social pressure. So the conscience can actually be wired into this collective consensus control grid. I often call it the cultural lid. And this can actually be seen and felt energetically. You can see and feel how your individual conscience or the value structures, the psychological, ideological value structures, have an energetic component through this will center that creates a conscience complex that actually wires directly into the collective field. And this expression of being can actually really limit one's will and one's actions because the conscience can be wired through this sort of trauma response of being in trouble or having done something wrong when you go up against the status quo. And so a lot of us really have to question our own conscience and say, okay, is my conscience actually rooted in, chosen value structures and moral structures that are true to me now, What is my value hierarchy, right? So if you can see a matrix within your energetic system, within your psychological, ideological, energetic system that has a value hierarchy in it, you should have core values that are more important to you than whether or not people accept you or not, or whether or not you are seen as a bad person. And this is something we really have to overcome if you want to be a true individual in the community sphere and actually speak for what you know to be true, for what you actually truly value. So this is part of this rewiring of the conscience, and I'll probably go more deeply into this in other videos. So it's imperative to rewire this conscience to direct your will, right? So one example of this trauma-based mind control through guilt and fear is the social conditioning to feel guilty for killing grandma, right, quote unquote, or grandpa, which is obviously a horrible thing. Nobody would want to do that. But to provide that conditioning or shock therapy without being encouraged to logically investigate the likely much worse implications of shutting down an entire global economy. Weighing the consequences of our actions and asking real questions. We all should have been doing this from the beginning, and I know a lot of us were. I know a lot of you were if you watch my videos, but the fact that that was censored in a way that you weren't really, it was taboo to ask these questions, and it was just this blanket conditioning around this guilt and shame. It's really easy to spot that stuff when you have a free conscience or a free will center that's truly aligned. And then when you have this right and left brain hemisphere synchronized and in harmony, working together, it's very easy to see through these tactics. So secondly, the fear of disinformation, okay? This new department or whatever they have, the federal government, around disinformation and this scary Poppins character. She, you know, going back to the villain savior phenomenon, she might be my villain. She might be somebody else's savior, but she's totally just a pawn, you know, just like everyone else involved in these agendas or whatever you want to call them. But this fear of disinformation, the conditioning around how the wrong information hurts people, rather than the understanding that people's own choices are what hurts them. This is another classic example of subversion of the center through guilt and fear. And again, you can see with this that in the absolving of personal responsibility, you sever the individual from your own inner authority and therefore subvert the power of the will center to an external institutional authority, right? You render the masses through the will center powerless in driving their own destiny. So when this center is operating smoothly, the sense of individual personal responsibility grows exponentially. And we realize that information does not hurt people. And the information I put out, although I want to be as true and as clear as possible, and I want to be as personally responsible that I'm not just throwing anything out there. But the truth of that is that someone else's actions based on information they find is their responsibility. So we are responsible for our own actions and whether or not they harm ourselves or others, right? Okay, so my own trauma-based mind control through conscience experience has been a deep and kind of long journey, in the sense that I have had to rewire my conscience in the ways that it was wired through a shame response around expressing myself, around saying anything that was against the status quo. Even if it wasn't against the status quo, mine was totally wired just naturally through expressing myself, period. So even expressing something that may or may not be vulnerable or may not be controversial, I had this shame, fear, trauma response wired into that. So every time I would express myself, especially, you know, well, even on the phone with a friend, like a vulnerable conversation, I would have a shame response after. And oftentimes there would be this really heavy guilt where, oh my gosh, I must have done something wrong. And if I did do something wrong, this means I'm in trouble. And if I'm in trouble, this means I'm in physical danger. Because for me, growing up, trouble, like doing something wrong, meant physical danger. So I was hypervigilant. I learned to be hypervigilant. And I learned that I was responsible for everyone's feelings around me. And so my expression came last. Right. And so I've had to rewire that and say, wait a minute, I actually have something to say, and you may or may not like it. And it may or may not even be true for you. But for me, this is important that I express this. Right. So that's been kind of my own experience with it. And it's literally wired through the nervous system. This is not something that you just get over by realizing that it's not real. Okay. And this is the thing about trauma responses, is that your mind, your conceptual mind, could realize it's not real all day long, but your body, your nervous system can still be caught in a loop that can be you have to be very consistent with rewiring that. So you have to come back to the tools over and over and over and over again, these meditation tools, these yoga tools, these protocols, to continue to calm the nervous system and remind the nervous system that we are not in danger, that it is okay to express ourselves. And especially when there's going to be a shame response from the mob or the group think, you know, the ones parroting these slogans and things. So the ideologies fed through propaganda often fit perfectly into the traumas passed down through generations, both in family systems and in culture. Through the mind and often conscience, things like media propaganda, institutional molding, social media, social pressure, all work together to subvert the human will. And one antidote to trauma-based mind control through ideological subversions is free and critical thought. questioning everything, and becoming one's own authority. Individual, free, and critical thought versus groupthink. Avoid subverting your individual thought processes to the world of isms. And this is really important. A lot of isms are actually ideological propaganda mechanisms that latch onto our trauma structures. We have these complex structures. They're energetic, they are psychological, and they are ideological, and they are biointelligent. And there are overlaps between all these different mind control structures, okay? And so the ideological aspect is often delivered collectively through isms. And even if you don't believe that it's an intentional mind control mechanism, the idea of an ism is that you're locking your mind into a sort of stale frame. If you want to be an alive, creative, present moment moving human being more often from day to day, if you want to move your creations from this alive, inspired, creative place, then we can't actually lock our mind into isms. We have to be constantly updating how we think and feel about things, right? We have to be flexible in our minds. We can't just lean on an ideology like a crutch. And especially when the traumas get kind of woven through that, then that really moves our will forward unconsciously. It becomes an unconscious mechanism. Okay, so in conclusion, that video was kind of a flop. The one I made yesterday was so much better. I was so much more on point. I stumbled and fumbled through this like crazy. I don't feel that great about it, but you know what? I can't record it a fifth time. I just can't. I can't bring myself to do it. So it's going out like this. It's going to go out like this. And you know what? You learn as you go. I'm trying to get set up. It's been an interesting beginning of this year. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for more. I love you all to pieces. And I hope you have a really great weekend and you can sort of bring yourself to laugh a little bit about some current events, because I tuned in for a second and it's actually pretty freaking hilarious. Miss Evil Scary Poppins and all of it, you know. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time, okay? Mwah. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.